When I was 9, I watched helplessly as my mother's blood splattered across the dining table and I froze, unable to move. It was that day that I realized true demons don't have claws or fangs, they share your surname. My name is Ruth Anderson, and I'm 76 years old now. Beneath my white hair and wrinkled hands lies a story few know. In the small town of Willow Creek in rural Kentucky, young people think of me as just a kind old lady selling homemade pies at the farmer's market on Sunday mornings, always smiling and saying comforting things. But if you look closely, you'll see that when I smile, only the corners of my mouth move. My eyes hold an ancient sadness. This is the mark of a life that began in destruction and was painstakingly rebuilt, bit by bit. Sharing this story has stirred up a lot of emotions within me, so I'd like to ask everyone to leave a comment and tell me where you saw this video, and please also give it a like. I've carried this burden alone for so many years, and I really don't want to feel lonely anymore. Knowing that someone is listening means a lot to me. Our house was far from town, a 2-mile walk along a dirt road that turned into a muddy mess on rainy days. The house was very simple. An unpainted wooden plank house, and the roof would leak in the corners during heavy rains. The yard was large, with tall grass, a few apple trees, chickens scrambling for food, and an old mongrel dog named Rusty that barked at everything it saw. Our family was no different from any other in town. My father, William, my mother, Eleanor, me, and my younger brother, Tommy, who was 2 years younger than me. My father worked at the sawmill and came home every day smelling of wood and sweat. My mother took care of everything at home, housework, the children, the vegetable garden in the backyard, and she also took on laundry jobs to supplement the family income. Her hands were always rough from hard work, but at night, she would gently stroke my hair until I fell asleep. When I was about 7 years old, everything started to change. My dad always complained of headaches that wouldn't go away no matter what he did. He said it felt like a hammer was constantly pounding in his head day and night. He became extremely irritable to any noise, and the slightest sound would make him yell at us. My mom tried to soothe him and take him to see a doctor in town, but he was stubborn and said he was just tired and would feel better in a while. But the headache didn't get better at all. In fact, it got worse, and what followed was something that still sends chills down my spine to this day. Mom said Dad started having a live fit. He would suddenly start shaking all over. His eyes would roll upwards, and he would mutter incoherent nonsense. Sometimes he would become very violent, smashing plates, breaking chairs, and pounding on the walls until his knuckles bled. "It's epilepsy," said Mrs. Miller, our nearest neighbor, who lives about a quarter of a mile away. "My cousin has it and has to take medication to control it." Once, Dad's condition was particularly severe. He said the walls were crawling with bugs and he almost set the house on fire. That's when Mom finally convinced him to go to the clinic. The doctor prescribed some medication, but it was expensive and hard to find, and Dad never took it properly. He said the medication made him sleepy and prevented him from working properly. I remember Mom trying to sneak medicine into his coffee, but Dad always found out and would fly into a rage. "Are you trying to poison me, you bitch?" He'd overturn the table, smashing everything on it to the floor. Tommy and I would run under the bed, clinging to each other, trembling with fear. His condition worsened, and he began to see and hear things that didn't exist, talking to the air, arguing with the voices in his head. Some days he didn't even recognize us, calling my mother by the wrong name, and saying that Tommy and I were devilish children who had broken into his house. My mother did everything she could to protect us. When she sensed he was about to have a seizure, she would take us to Mrs. Miller's house or hide us in the tool shed in the backyard. "Stay put with your brother," she would whisper, "and don't make a sound no matter what you hear." But we still heard many terrible sounds, screams, the sound of things breaking, my mother's muffled sobs, and my father's unreasonable accusations. Sometimes he would say that my mother was having an affair, that she wanted to steal his money, and that she wanted to kill him while he slept. Once, after he had an attack, we returned home and saw Mom sitting on the doorstep in the backyard, her eyes bruised and her lips chapped. She covered her wounds with her hands and managed a weak smile when she saw me. "It's all right, Ruth." I tripped and bumped my head on the corner of the table. I knew she was lying, but I pretended to believe her. It would be easier that way. Days passed and things got worse. Dad had a severe episode of violent disorder at the sawmill, threatening his colleagues with a chisel and losing his job. He started drinking more, sometimes mixing his medication with whiskey, which only made things worse. The family's finances became increasingly strained, relying entirely on Mom's laundry earnings and the vegetables grown in the garden to survive. "Mom, why don't we run away?" One night, after Dad smashed half a plate in the kitchen and finally fell asleep, I asked her quietly as I cleaned up the mess, trying not to make a sound. "Darling, where can we go?" she replied, her eyes weary, looking much older than her 32 years. "I have no family left, and I haven't saved any money. And your father, he's not a bad person, Ruth. It's that illness that's causing it. In his confused mind, there's still that man I once loved, your father." I want to believe her, I really do. Sometimes, on his better days, when the pain lessened and he took his medication properly, we could glimpse the old dad. He would sit on the wooden bench in the yard, calling us over to watch the sunset together, telling stories of his childhood, humming old tunes while fixing things around the house. During those times, Mom's eyes were filled with love as she looked at him, and it broke my heart, as if she wanted to hold on to those moments forever. But those good days became fewer and fewer until finally, they almost disappeared altogether. His illness flared up more and more frequently. Even when he wasn't having an attack, he was always suspicious, irritable, and delusional. I'll never forget that Wednesday night. It was pouring rain outside, the kind of summer downpour that felt like it was going to rip the roof off. The raindrops pounded on the tin roof, making a deafening noise. Tommy and I were already in bed, pretending to be asleep, but I was on high alert. Dad was always particularly irritable on rainy days, and he said the sound of rain made the sounds in his head even louder. I heard my mother scream, followed by the sound of a chair falling over. Unfortunately, this was nothing new to us. I pulled the blanket over Tommy's head. He had already started to sob quietly. "Sure, it'll pass," I lied as usual, but that night was different. The screams grew louder, and I heard my mother pleading, "William, for God's sake, put that thing down. Don't you know what you're doing?" Then I heard a sound I'd never heard before, like a watermelon shattering on the floor, a dull thud followed by a wet sound, then deathly silence, broken only by the sound of the rain outside. That silence terrified me more than any scream. I got out of bed, though I knew I shouldn't. "Stay here," I whispered to Tommy. "Don't come out no matter what." I walked barefoot down the dark corridor, the old wooden floorboards creaking. The kitchen door wasn't closed tightly, letting in a sliver of light. I gently pushed the door open, just a crack, and I could see just enough of that scene etched into my mind to this day, like a photograph that will never fade. My mother lay on the cold cement floor, blood trickling from her head, slowly pooling. My father held the wooden pestle she used to grind spices, now stained red. His eyes were vacant, as if he were in a daze. "They've finally stopped," he said, his voice so calm I hadn't heard it in a long time. I don't know if he saw me, frozen in fear. I only know that I ran back to my room, grabbed Tommy's hand, and hid in the closet. We huddled there, trembling, until dawn. What happened that night and the days that followed was so painful that even now, almost 70 years later, my hands are still trembling as I write this. But I must tell you, I need you to know, because the real nightmare has only just begun. When the sun rose on Thursday, I was still in the closet holding Tommy, who had fallen asleep sobbing. I was aching all over and had been curled up all night, but what bothered me more was the deathly silence in the house. It was so heavy that it felt like the whole world had stopped breathing along with my mother. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and the bedroom door opened. "Ruth, Tommy." Dad's voice sounded normal, almost the same as before he got sick. For a moment, I frantically thought that everything before was a terrible nightmare, and that when I woke up I would smell the aroma of Mom making cornbread in the kitchen. But reality was different. Dad found us in the closet, and his eyes had changed, no longer dull like when he had an episode, nor angry as usual, but empty, like a dried-up well, bottomless. "Come here," he said with unusual calm. "We have to get things sorted out." "Sorted out?" As if he could undo everything that had happened, could piece our broken family back together. When I came out of the bedroom, I saw that he had already wrapped my mother's body in a sheet. There were dark stains on the kitchen floor, traces of his attempts to clean them. The smell of blood mixed with bleach made me want to vomit. "Your father is sick, but he will take care of you," he said, referring to himself as someone else, perhaps in his heart. He really was someone else. "We can't tell anyone what happened. It was an accident. She slipped, understand." Tommy started crying softly again, and his father grabbed his arm roughly. "Do you understand, kid? She slipped." I nodded quickly and pulled Tommy tightly to my side. "Yes, Dad, we understand." That morning, it was still raining. Dad dug a hole behind the chicken coop in the backyard. He buried Mom there. There was no coffin, no priest, just that blood-stained sheet. We watched from the bedroom window, unable to cry, as if all our tears had been drained by endless fear. In the days that followed, Dad told the neighbors that Mom had gone to Louisville to visit her sick cousin. No one asked any questions because of Dad's eccentricities. Everyone tried to avoid our house. Mrs. Miller even offered to help take care of us while Mom was away, but Dad refused, saying he could manage on his own. Life continued in a terrifyingly bizarre state. Dad took us to school, cooked, which was terrible, nowhere near as good as Mom's, and did our laundry haphazardly. Sometimes he seemed almost normal, as if his condition had improved. He didn't talk much, and he didn't have any more violent outbursts. Later I learned that he had completely stopped taking his medication and drinking, as if he were living in another world, a world where those terrible things had never happened. The nights were even harder. Tommy and I lay in bed cuddling each other as usual, but now there was no longer the comfort of knowing Mom was in the next room. We knew she was alone in the dark, under the damp dirt in the backyard. About 2 weeks later, one night, I heard the bedroom door slowly open. It was common for Dad to come and check if we were asleep, so I pretended to be asleep as usual. But this time was different. I felt the mattress sink, and he sat on the edge of the bed. "So much like her," he whispered, running his hand through my hair. Hair, same eyes." I closed my eyes tightly, trying to keep my breathing even, praying he would leave quickly. But his hand didn't stop. It traced my face and neck, finally touching a place a father should never touch his daughter. That night, something inside me shattered forever, never to be fully repaired. I learned a lesson a child should never learn. Sometimes, the devil doesn't just live in your house. He is your own flesh and blood. These nights became recurring nightmares. I tried to lock the door, but he ripped the bolt off. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually overcame me. I tried to scream, but he covered my mouth with his muddy and sweaty hands. During the day, however, he acted as if nothing had happened, as if we were still a normal family, just without our mother. Tommy sensed something was wrong, but he was too young to understand what was happening. He only knew that his sister, who had always protected him, was now hiding and crying and trembling when her father approached. I tried to find excuses to send him to Mrs. Miller's house for the night, at least to keep him safe. At school, my grades plummeted. The teacher noticed my sudden change and spoke with my father. "She used to be so cheerful, but now she doesn't talk to anyone," the teacher asked. "Mr. Anderson, has something happened?" "She just misses her mother," he replied, perfectly playing the role of a worried father. "We're all very sad. Her cousin is very ill and won't be back for a while." The teacher, of course, believed him. Who would doubt a seemingly respectable widower raising a child alone? I tried telling others, telling Mrs. Miller. "My father does bad things to me at night," I managed to say, my voice barely audible. "He shouldn't do that." She looked at me sympathetically, but with suspicion in her eyes. "Child, don't talk nonsense. Your father is sick, and sometimes he does things he doesn't even know he's doing, but certainly not what you're saying. You must have seen something and are just imagining things." Since then, I've never tried to tell anyone again. Who would believe a 9-year-old girl instead of an adult? The days dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I started losing weight, had terrible nightmares, and would jump in fright at the slightest touch. But no one noticed, and even if they did, they chose to ignore it. On one of the darkest nights of my life, my father smelled of whiskey again, and his hands were rougher than usual. I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't let Tommy suffer the same thing when he grew up. I couldn't let the man I once called Dad destroy everything that was left of our family. That night, he finally fell asleep, snoring loudly. I quietly got up, my mind made up. If no one was willing to help me, I would have to save myself. Deep inside the kitchen cupboard was the rat poison Dad used. The bottle had a skull and crossbones drawn on it, a warning of danger. Mom used to always keep it far away, afraid we might accidentally touch it. I held the small, trembling bottle, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. I was only 9 years old, but I was no longer a child. My childhood had ended on that rainy night when my mother's blood splattered all over the kitchen floor. My plan was simple. Dad would drink black coffee every morning, lots of sugar, until it was very strong. The bitterness of the poison should be masked, and everything would be over. Tommy and I would run to town and say he had a fit and fell down. No one would suspect anything. Everyone knew about his eccentricities. But as I stood there, holding the poison, something strange happened. I felt my mother beside me, and I could almost smell the cheap perfume she wore to church on Sundays. A voice inside me said, "Honey, this isn't the way to solve this." I didn't know if it was truly her spirit, my own conscience, or simply fear of the consequences. I knew it. I put the poison back in the cupboard, went back to my bedroom, and cried silently. But that night wasn't in vain. Although I failed to carry out that extreme plan, something awakened within me, the will to fight, the desire to survive, the determination to find another way out. I won't always be a victim. I need to be smart, patient, and wait for the right opportunity. The timing came sooner than I expected, and in a way that completely surprised me. When I woke up the next morning, I felt different. I had a clarity I hadn't felt in months. As I made coffee, I looked out the kitchen window at the place where my mother was buried and made a decision. The truth would be my weapon. I couldn't use poison. That would make me no different from him. But I could use the truth buried in our backyard, the truth that no one but the three of us knew. Sheriff Johnson visits families in remote areas every first Monday of the month to check on things and make sure the children are at school. It's a new government program. He'll be there in 2 days. For the past 2 days, I've acted more nonchalantly than ever before. I smiled when Dad spoke to me. I didn't back down when he approached. I cooked the way he liked. At first, he was suspicious, staring at me with those eyes that were always as gloomy as the sky before a storm. "Something's wrong? Girl, what's wrong?" "Nothing, Dad," I replied. "I just miss Mom and feel like I should help out more around the house." He seemed to believe me, or rather, he wanted to believe me. When he came to my room that night, I didn't resist. I held back my tears and disgust, thinking only that I would be free in 2 days. On Monday, Sheriff Johnson arrived on his brown horse, and I was waiting at the door. I'd taken Tommy to Mrs. Miller's early that morning to help Dad clean the chicken coop, as it would smell awful. "Good morning, Sheriff Johnson," I said, trying to sound normal. "Good morning, little one. Is your dad home?" "Yes, but he's still sleeping," I said. "He had a seizure last night, and the medication is keeping him very asleep." The sheriff nodded in understanding. Everyone knew about Dad's illness. "Can I show you something?" I asked, my heart pounding, afraid he could hear. "It's a secret, but you have to know." "What secret, child?" "It's about my mother," I said. "She didn't go to Louisville to see any cousin." The sheriff's face changed, becoming serious. He dismounted. "What do you want to say? Please come with me." I led him to the backyard behind the chicken coop, where my mother was buried. Even after all this time, there was still a small mound of earth. I pointed silently. "What's this, child?" "My mother," I said calmly, but tears streamed down my face. "My father killed her one rainy night, smashing her head with a pestle." I saw it. The sheriff was deathly pale. He looked at me, then at the mound of earth, then back at me. "Are you sure you're telling the truth? This is a very serious charge." "I'm sure," I said. "He buried her here, wrapped in her favorite floral sheet. You can see it when you dig it up. It's true." I don't want to describe what happened next, how they dug through the soil and found my mother's decomposed body, but still recognizable by the blue beaded necklace she always wore, how my father was awakened by the noise, ran out of the house, and shouted that the voice in his head made him do it, that it wasn't his fault, how he was found 3 days later hiding in a cave by the river, mentally deranged and still talking to himself, how he confessed everything, not only about my mother's death, but also what he did to me those nights. He went to prison and never came out. Years later, I heard that he got into a fight with other prisoners and was beaten to death. Those prisoners knew what he had done to his daughter. When I heard this news, I felt nothing Neither joy nor sorrow, only an emptiness. The place that had once been filled with fear and anger was now empty. Tommy and I went to stay with Aunt Martha, Dad's sister, whom we hadn't even known existed before. She lived in Cincinnati, was unmarried, and worked as a nurse at a large hospital. She had never wanted children, but she welcomed us with open arms, as if she had been waiting for us her whole life. "Blood is thicker than water," she said when we arrived, looking at the two frightened children clinging to each other, carrying only a small bag of clothes. Aunt Martha was unlike anyone we knew. She wore trousers instead of skirts, drove herself, had a job outside the home, and was outspoken. Back home, the women whispered that she was too modern, which was why she hadn't found a husband. But to me, she was exactly the kind of person we needed. For the first few months, I had nightmares almost every night, waking up screaming in a cold sweat, the image of my mother's blood and my father's hands haunting me in the darkness. Aunt Martha never got angry. She would come into my room, turn on the light, there was electricity in the big city, sit on the edge of the bed, and stay with me until I calmed down. "Ruth, what you've been through is terrible," she would say bluntly, "but one day, this pain will become a scar, not a bleeding wound." At first, I didn't believe her. How could I possibly overcome something so terrible? How could I possibly live a normal life? But Aunt Martha was persistent. She found me a good school and even a psychologist, something unheard of in my hometown. She encouraged me to do more than just study, swimming, playing the piano, painting, anything that could occupy my mind and body, building new memories on top of old ones. "Child," she said, "you need to learn to live again, not just to survive." As time went by, the nightmares lessened. I started smiling again, made friends at school, and no longer felt ashamed of my body when I looked in the mirror. Tommy also gradually became more outgoing in the big city, soon running and playing baseball with the neighborhood boys, coming home with scrapes on his knees, and having countless funny stories to tell. At 15, I decided I wanted to be a teacher. I thought of Miss Stevens back home, who noticed something was wrong with me but didn't know how to help. I realized there must be many other children like me, silently suffering with no one to reach out to them. I wanted to do something for those children. Aunt Martha supported my decision and helped me get into teachers' college. Those years were tough, but also meaningful. By 18, I was teaching preschoolers at a community school. Seeing those little faces light up with new knowledge was like a balm for my wounded soul. Life goes on. Tommy graduated from medical school, much to Aunt Martha's delight. I met Jim at a school event. He was the father of one of my students, recently widowed and raising a 5-year-old son alone. We started by talking about the challenges of raising a child, then moved on to music and literature, and before we knew it, we were dating. Even after all these years, it's still difficult for me to be near men. Their touch always brings back memories I want to forget. Jim noticed my unease. He was patient and respectful. When I finally told him about my past, he held my hand and cried softly. "None of this matters to me," he said. "Ruth, what matters is who you are now. You are the strongest and kindest woman I've ever met." On a Sunday in the spring of 1970, we got married. I was 24 and felt like I was finally starting to truly live. Jim, his son Mark, and I formed a family I had never dared to imagine. 3 years later, we had our daughter Emily, a curly-haired, bright-smiling little girl who became the center of our world. Holding my newborn daughter, I made her a promise no one had ever made to me. She would always be safe, always loved, and as long as I lived, I would not let any evil harm her. As a child, I used the truth as a weapon to get revenge on my father. That wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a long journey, healing, rebuilding, and ultimately, having a complete life that no one could have predicted. The terrified little girl from rural Kentucky has finally grown up. As the years passed, the children grew up, and much changed in America and the world. Looking back, my life, like everyone else's, has been full of ups and downs, but the shadows of the past have never completely disappeared. Jim was a good husband and a decent man who helped me rebuild trust in others and in myself. We were together for 35 years until 2005, when lung cancer took his life. Although there were the usual bumps in the road in any marriage, those years were wonderful. We raised our children with love and respect, Values that came partly from the years I spent with my mother and partly from Aunt Martha. Mark, Jim's son, is like my own. He became an engineer, married young, and gave me 3 grandchildren, the apple of my eye. My biological daughter, Emily, followed in my footsteps, becoming a teacher and doing even better. She now runs a school for underprivileged children in suburban Cincinnati. My brother, Tommy, became a pediatrician, and he always jokes that he chose to take care of the children because of me, because when no one else could protect him, I was the one who took care of him. Despite this seemingly happy and fulfilling life, I've carried a heavy secret in my heart for decades. No one knows what happened in that Kentucky house except Jim, Aunt Martha, and Tommy. My children don't know. My colleagues don't know. Nobody knows. Ruth, why bring up those painful memories again? Aunt Martha would always say when we talked about it, let bygones be bygones. But it's not that simple. The past always finds its way back in a strange way when we least expect it. When I was 50, I had my first breakdown. I was teaching 3rd grade when a new, skinny little boy walked into the classroom. His eyes were filled with fear, and he had finger marks on his arm. Seeing those marks, I suddenly felt like I wasn't in the classroom anymore, but back in that house in Kentucky, feeling my father's hand on my small body. I fainted in front of the whole class. When I woke up, I was in the school infirmary, and I knew I had to confront what I had buried for far too long. I could no longer pretend that terrified little girl wasn't a part of me. That's when I began therapy, even though I was middle-aged. My therapist, Dr. Sarah, was only half my age, but from day one, her wisdom impressed me. Mrs. Ruth, she explained, trauma doesn't disappear with time. It's stored in the body and the memory, but we can learn to coexist with it in different ways. Over the next few years, I unearthed those fragments I had pushed deep into my memory, shedding tears I should have shed decades ago. I was angry with my mother, angry that she hadn't protected me better, angry with my father, angry that he had destroyed our family, angry with God, angry that he allowed it all to happen. Anger is part of the process, Dr. Sarah said. You don't have to be ashamed of it. Gradually, I began to understand. Dad was a patient, not just a bad person. Mom had done her best with all her abilities, and I, a 9-year-old child, was powerless at that time. Forgiveness is not easy, nor is it something that happens overnight. It's like raindrops, slowly filling a bucket. I forgave Mom first, then I forgave myself. Forgiving Dad is the hardest. Sometimes I feel that I'm still in that process. At 60, I made a decision that once again changed the course of my life. I would tell my children my story. Emily cried after hearing it, while Mark sat silently, staring into the distance, as if trying to process everything he had heard. Then, they hugged me in a way they had never done before. Not children hugging their mother, but adults wanting to protect the ones they love. Mom, why didn't you ever tell us before? Emily asked, wiping away her tears. I wanted to protect you, I answered honestly. I wanted you to grow up without the burden of the story, and maybe I was ashamed, afraid of being judged, embarrassed by those things. Mark looked genuinely surprised. Mom, you're a victim, you're a survivor. The word survivor has been echoing in my mind for days. I've never seen myself that way before. I've always felt like a victim, a pitiful person, someone with invisible scars. But survivor, it sounds positive, it sounds powerful. After that conversation, something inside me changed. I began to speak more openly about my experience, not to everyone, of course, but to those who might benefit from my story. I joined a support group for female victims of violence, gave lectures at schools about signs of child abuse, and volunteered at a shelter for children who had suffered violence. With each recount of my story, with each handshake, the burden in my heart lessened. Not because I had forgotten, but because I had given those painful memories new meaning. They were no longer just the story of a suffering girl, but the story of a survivor determined to help others live. At 70, I had retired from teaching, but remained active in volunteer work. I received an unusual invitation. A journalist wanted to interview child abuse survivors to make a documentary. My name had been recommended by a coordinator at the shelter. My first reaction was to refuse. Sharing my story in a small group was one thing. Sharing it on camera, in front of strangers, was quite another. But then I thought, how many people could benefit from this? How many children could be saved if more people paid attention to these signs? I'm willing, I told Jim that night. Even though he's been gone for years, I still talk to him before bed. I think it's time to bring this story out of the shadows completely. The interview process was difficult. Relating everything in detail in front of strangers, under lights and cameras, was one of the most challenging things I've ever done. But at the end of the interview, I felt an unprecedented sense of relief, almost floating out of my chair. The documentary, titled The Silent Voice, won awards and was shown in schools, universities, and police stations. I received hundreds of letters and emails. My granddaughter taught me how to use a computer when I was 72, and the writers found resonance in my story, finding the courage to seek help after hearing my account. A letter deeply moved me. It came from an 85-year-old woman whose handwriting trembled. Dear Ruth, when I was 12, my stepfather did something to me that I never told anyone. I kept this secret for 73 years, thinking I would take it to my grave. After reading your testimony, I told my daughter, it feels like a huge weight has been lifted off my shoulders. Thank you for giving me the courage. Reading these words, I cried. I thought about how silence imprisons us. We think keeping secrets is protecting ourselves, but in reality, we are feeding the darkness. Now I'm 76, sitting in a rocking chair on my porch in Cincinnati, looking at the busy street, so different from the dirt road of my childhood. I realize that my story isn't just about pain and overcoming it, but about the importance of truth. Even if it hurts, it's about breaking the silence that protects the perpetrators and imprisons the victims. What I went through, thousands of children in America and around the world are still going through today. Like me, they have no voice, nowhere to run, and no one believes them. Their homes, which should be safe, have become prisons of fear. If you are listening to me right now and you are one of those children, I want you to know, this is not your fault, never. You deserve to be protected, loved, and respected. Your voice matters, your story matters. Don't give up seeking help until you find someone who believes in you. If you are an adult who suffered abuse in childhood and still carries the secret, know that it's never too late to start healing those wounds. Silence only protects those who hurt you. Your story, no matter how painful, can become a light to guide others out of darkness. Growing old has a strange way of reminding us of memories we thought we had forgotten. Now that I'm almost 80, I feel the past knocking on my door again with renewed force. It's as if time hasn't diluted the memories, but rather refined them, leaving only the most essential parts, sometimes sweet, often bitter, but always unforgettable. My grandchildren often ask me how I overcame all of this. The truth is, I never completely overcame it. This level of trauma, you can't overcome it, you can only learn to live with it, like a tree growing under wire. The scars blend into the trunk and become part of its structure. At 65, I did something I never thought I would do. I went back to Willow Creek. The town had changed so much I almost didn't recognize it. The main street was paved with asphalt. A large supermarket had been built, and there was even a bank branch. The creek where Tommy and I used to play had been turned into a canal. The house where I grew up was gone, replaced by a bakery. A young waiter brought me coffee. I sat there, right where my mother had been hastily buried, the place that had shattered my childhood on that rainy night. The coffee was hot and sweet. I sipped it slowly, feeling the warmth slide down my throat, dispelling the chill that always crept over me whenever I recalled that past. Are you a local? The young man asked, noticing my dazed look. A long time ago. I didn't say more. What was the point? He wasn't even born when all this happened. To him, this was just his father's bakery, no different from any other business. The ghost I saw there belonged only to me. During that trip, I also visited the local cemetery. After my story became famous through the documentary, the town council arranged for my mother's remains to be moved to a suitable burial site. I brought flowers, red carnations, just like the ones she used to plant on the porch. I stayed there for a while, silently talking to her, telling her about my children, my grandchildren, the life I had built with everything I had. Mom, you'll be proud of me, I whispered before leaving. It was a farewell, an ending. I've never gone back since, and I don't intend to. Some doors need to be closed before we can move on. At 70, I lost Tommy, my brother, the only person in the world who shared my nightmares. He died after battling Alzheimer's, a terrible disease that slowly eroded his memory. Eventually, he no longer recognized me, mistaking me for our mother. "Mom, I'm scared. Dad's yelling again," he would say, his eyes lost in a past I hoped he would forget. His departure left an unfillable void in my heart, as if the last witness to my story had vanished, leaving me alone with my memories. Aunt Martha passed away years ago, taking with her the strength that supported me when I needed it most. Jim is gone too. Those who helped us up when we fell have all gone on their own journeys, leaving us to continue living and passing on what we've learned. After Tommy passed away, I began writing my memoir. Not for publication, but simply to ensure the story wouldn't go with me, so that when I'm gone, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren could better understand who their grandmother was and where the strength people say I possessed came from. Writing is a form of therapy. Every word written on paper is like a small tombstone, finally sealing away that past that had long been open, exposed, and bleeding. After finishing the manuscript, I gave a copy to each child. Emily cried when she received it, and Mark held the envelope to his chest for a long time before he could speak. "Mom, thank you for trusting us. We will cherish it." In 2020, the pandemic struck, bringing fear and isolation. I discovered that my life experiences somehow prepared me for crisis. While many succumbed to despair due to isolation, I drew strength from the loneliness and hardship I had overcome before. I supported my grandchildren via video calls, yet another new skill I had to learn, told stories to my young great-grandchildren, and organized online prayer groups with friends at church. Somehow my age, which many consider a weakness, became my greatest strength. I've been through so much, survived so much, and a pandemic, though terrible, wouldn't break me. "Grandma is indestructible," my grandson Peter joked during a video call. Not entirely, I thought. I'm not indestructible. I've been destroyed several times in my life, but I've learned to rebuild myself little by little, to become stronger where I'm broken. Recently, Emily invited me to give a presentation to the teachers at her school. It was a training session on recognizing signs of child abuse. At first, I hesitated. I'm too old for this, I thought. But I finally agreed. Sitting before those vibrant and hopeful young women, I told my story once again. I spoke of that rainy night, the sound of the pestle hitting my mother's head, the moment my father's hand violated my innocence, and the moment I decided to fight him with the truth. I also spoke of rebuilding, of psychotherapy, and of difficult and incomplete forgiveness. After the speech, a young teacher raised her hand, tears welling in her eyes. "Having gone through all this, how did you manage not to become a resentful person?" This question caught me off guard. I had never thought about it before. After a few seconds of thought, I answered, "I think it's a choice I have to make every day. Every morning when I wake up, I have to decide, do I let what happened to me define who I am today, or do I use it as strength to create a different life?" Choosing the harder path isn't always easy. Some days, resentment seems like the only option. But at some point, I realized that if I chose hatred and resentment, even if my father were dead, he would continue to destroy me. I couldn't allow that to happen. Growing old means facing the finiteness of life with greater clarity. At 76, I know my past is longer than my future, but that doesn't frighten me as much as it should. I've lived enough, loved enough, and suffered enough. Whatever comes next, I'm ready. Looking back, I see a long and winding road. Some places were so dark that I could barely see the next step. Others were illuminated by a joy that only those who have experienced profound suffering can truly understand. It was a complete life, full of both pain and beauty. If I could give that 9-year-old girl, the one trembling in the closet, watching her world crumble, one piece of advice, I would only say, hang in there, little one. It's going to be a long and difficult road, but you will make it. One day you will be an old lady, sitting on your porch watching the sunset, surrounded by people who love you. One day you will tell your story and help others through their own storms. On that day, you will understand that, in some mysterious way that we cannot fully comprehend, nothing was in vain. If my story touches your heart in any way, I urge you to share it with others who may need to hear this message of hope. Click the like button to let more people know the story, which may give them the courage to face their own difficulties. Subscribe to our channel for other true survival and faith stories we share daily. May God be with you.